Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. Tensions in the Middle East have been boiling for nearly 2 years now since the war between Israel and Hamas began on the 7th of October 2023. The Biden administration has been in support of Israel's self-defense and objective of eliminating the threat posed by the Hamas. As per the Middle East Institute, the Biden administration has been advocating for the safe return of hostages and preventing a wider regional conflict. President Biden has also vouched for the creation of a post-war plan for a two-state solution and a wider regional normalization. Joining us right now to take this discussion forward is Damon, award-winning former international journalist with the CNN and also the president of the International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance. She's also the granddaughter of the former Prime Minister of Syria, Mohsen al-Barazi, who was executed in August 1949 in a coup. Damon, thank you very much for joining us on the program. How do you think the Biden administration is doing in its final phase and the last-ditch attempt by the Biden administration to restore peace and normalcy in the Middle East?
Well, frankly, they are doing as abysmally as they have been doing all along, especially when it comes to what has transpired in Gaza, because either the Biden administration is unwilling to see reality on the ground, or, and this is perhaps, even worse, willing to allow Israel to quite literally get away with murder. There is no way that you spend any amount of time in Gaza, and I was just there for a month, and it was my 4th trip in on a humanitarian mission with my charity. There's no way you spend even a day in Gaza and walk away thinking that this is self-defense. And that's in the size of the bombs that are being dropped, the locations that they're being dropped on, but also in humanitarian organizations continuously and consistently being blocked by Israel from delivering aid. Hamas is not stealing the aid. And all Gazans want right now is for this to end. And yet the US, despite its ability to, in theory, put pressure on Israel, has been unwilling or unable to do so. When it comes to the broader region, you have to realize that this is a region that is justifiably extraordinarily skeptical when it comes to US intentions. And one just needs to turn to the war in Iraq. But even before that, this is not a region that trusts the United States, and this is not a region that necessarily wants the United States to be guiding a way forward. When it specifically comes to what's been happening in Syria, interestingly, when incoming President Donald Trump put out his tweet saying that his Syria strategy was going to be to stay out of it, I was actually with a number of very active Syrian opposition members, very active in the political circles, and their first reaction to that was, thank God, we do not want the US involved in our business.
Right. Do you feel that the Trump administration may be better at handling things, as Trump has been signaling and messaging that he does not want to get involved in more wars in the Middle East? Syria is not our business. Do you think that will put the US in a better position?
Not necessarily. We need to remember that whether it's, a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, US policy towards the Middle East does not change. And the cornerstone of US policy in the Middle East has been supporting Israel no matter what. So in that sense, there isn't a lot of optimism that things are going to change. Plus, we have to remember what Donald Trump did his first term in office, which really, set off thunderstorms across the region when he moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But at the same time, when it comes to countries like Syria, for example, there is perhaps a sense of relief that the US is not going to at least attempt to meddle in Syria's internal affairs, because all of its past attempts have effectively fallen flat on their face. And again, it goes back to this reality where, US intentions are not trusted, US actions are not trusted, and very few who actually observe the region and know it well believe that the US truly has a rich enough understanding of how the dynamics here work to be able to take the right kinds of decisions. If we just look at Iraq, it's a clear-cut example of what happens when America is in charge.
Right. What, according to you, led to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, and how can the situation in Syria further complicate matters in the Middle East?
Look, I have been covering Syria since, 2011, since the get-go, and the speed with which the rebels were able to take over, I mean, it floored me, it shocked me, just like everybody else. And I think it's a combination of things. First of all, a lot of lessons have been learned over the last 13 years, militarily speaking, when it comes to these rebel forces. And there was an awareness that this cannot just be a one faction offensive. Yes, it was led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but this was definitely coordinated. They had joint operation rooms, and as more rebel entities began joining in the fight, they also continued to absorb them into this coordinated mechanism. The other reality is that Iran significantly weakened, obviously highly focused, losing its, foothold with Hamas, losing its foothold in Lebanon with Hezbollah, numerous Israeli strikes against Iran. But the key in all of this, though, is not necessarily Iran, it's Russia. What really stopped the rebels from taking over back in 2012, 2013 was the way that Russia dominated the skies. And Russia did not do that this time. And Russia itself has been highly preoccupied in Ukraine, but there's also a lot of speculation as to whether or not a deal was cut. My sense is that once the rebels pushed through, quickly took over Aleppo, began moving towards Hama and Homs, that is probably the moment when a deal would have actually been cut between Russia and rebel forces. Remember, Russia's key interest in Syria is not necessarily propping up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, but rather wanting to maintain its foothold in the Middle East. So that's going to be something quite interesting to watch. We also need to remember that what we're looking at right now is a much more politically savvy opposition, whether that is the opposition inside Syria or opposition members outside Syria who continuously have been working and planning for this day after, so to speak. And so we have been seeing quite a bit of maturity in actions that have been taken up until this point, not to forget also that Syrians have been watching what happened in Iraq. They've been watching what happened in Libya, and those lessons have been learned as well.
Right. In terms of the human tragedy that we're looking at, there are a large number of women, large number of children who have been impacted by this tragedy, of course, in Gaza, and the fight still continues. When it comes to Syria, a lot of people have been displaced. Give us a sense of how the situation in Syria has added to the humanitarian crisis that we've now been seeing since October last year.
I mean, Syria has always been catastrophic. If we look at what happened since 2011, you have upwards of 500,000 people who were killed. You have millions who were internally displaced, millions and millions more who were forced outside of Syria's borders. You have, according to one Syrian watchdog group, more than 158,000 people who disappeared into the Assad regime's dark, ominous prison system. The vast majority of them turned up dead, or their families still don't know where they are. And so Syria has lost a lot to get to this point. And when it comes to the humanitarian side of things, the Syria appeals were never fully funded. I think at best, there was 1 year when Syria was maybe 40% funded. Large swaths of the country were destroyed and remain destroyed. There was very little effort on the part of the Assad regime to rebuild areas once it took control over them. Syria's infrastructure is in shambles. Its economy is effectively broken. And on top of all of that, you now have these new waves of displacement that have been caused by this rebel offensive and by some of the fighting that took place, although a lot of it seems to have quieted down up until now. And then you also have Syrians that want to return back home, but there's no infrastructure in place to be able to receive them. And as we see time and time again, it is the civilian population that not only pays the price, but among that, women and children who are constantly and consistently the most vulnerable. We look at Gaza, and that is exactly what is happening there too. Of course, different dynamics, different war, but again, you have this extreme, incomprehensible level of civilian suffering there as well.
Arva, would be, how would the Biden administration and their period in power be remembered when we speak about US relations with the Middle East in future? And what are the challenges would they leave behind for the Trump administration?
The legacy is certainly going to be a dark legacy. And I would actually, take it back to Biden's years as Obama's vice president, where even back then, the US administration made horrific mistakes in Iraq, allowed red lines to be crossed in Syria. And now the Biden administration is very much going to be remembered as being the administration that stood behind Israel as Israel carried out multiple devastating strikes on civilian locations, herded Gazans around the Gaza Strip as if they were cattle, only to bomb them in places that were safe, and impeded humanitarian organizations from being able to carry out their job.
Damon, thank you so much for joining us on program on Global Eye on CNBC TV 18. It was a pleasure talking to you, and this is a story that we will continue tracking very closely on CNBC TV 18. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.